The idea for this exhibition was that we would show new work alongside existing work, and then when we started looking at possibilities, realised that the possibilities were very few and far between when it comes to existing work, because most of the work is destroyed or partially destroyed after the show ends, because of its scale, and because often there's parts that are fixed down, or they can't be stored. There's also the issue of whether it's right to show work that was made originally for a very specific site. So something, for instance, like the installation that I made at Venice in 2005 in the Venetian Palazzo, that is kind of dripping with atmosphere and very much relates to the specifics of that space. So for this show, therefore, we came up with an idea to take a number of smaller elements that do survive from right across a whole range of different exhibitions, that at the time were elements of larger scale works which had a whole kind of range of different materials and aesthetic and mood and concepts behind them, and to sort of take some of these objects and put them together in new arrangements where we're relying on them existing as objects in their own right. So that's the challenge for this, and it is an experimentation. So the project that's called Open Wide, that's downstairs, that has kind of grown out of this idea. And what I've done is designed a number of plinth and wall structures that are a little bit unconventional, in that some are ramps and some are troughs and some are low platforms. So it does become more museum-like, but I think that's it's an interesting way to try and approach this problem. One of the things that I'm trying to create with the installations that I make is a sense of some kind of scenario or some kind of action being played out, but as if someone's pressed pause, so that the objects have a relationship to everyday objects. There's a familiarity about them, but they can't be placed. So it's important to me that I don't use found objects, that every single element is made. But because the forms are ambiguous, then there's an element of kind of guesswork needed in terms of how somebody interprets what's in front of them, what they're experiencing. So it is kind of open-ended, and I enjoy that, the scope for this kind of multiple readings, or the viewer's imagination to kind of fill that gap as to what these objects may be used for. I think with some of especially the simplest forms, so the hoops and rods and spikes, I think people kind of easily kind of project a sense of the figurative onto them, and I think also they're very easily interpreted in terms of kind of sexual or violent connotations. I think because of this sort of simplicity, it's something that we're kind of used to doing, is kind of projecting that. If you're not using found objects, then you need to create your own objects, but they need to have some kind of authenticity about them. So with certain things that can be designed, then they can be made by other people, but with other parts, then I do try to make them myself, because then you have more control over their form. And often the more you learn about the process, whether it's ceramics or wood turning or sewing, then often you end up with something that was much closer to the feeling that you wanted to create in the first place. I very much kind of gravitate towards materials that we understand through being in contact with them in our daily lives. So things like porcelain and wood and square tube metal frames and leather. We kind of understand the physical characteristics and their effect on us and their meanings, and to an extent we understand where they originate, where they come from, how they kind of come to be, and the kind of scope and limitations of their usage. And I think that's something that's quite kind of key in the work. The two works upstairs are new works that have been devised with this space in mind. I was thinking about a number of different, almost kind of encampments around the gallery that were looking at living and working, so sort of the domestic environment somehow kind of opposed to a kind of working or leisure environment. And that was just a very initial thoughts at the start. And so that has kind of grown into, over a number of months, these two installations. A lot of the work that I make isn't fixed or final, I think partly because of the process that I adopt, where the gallery space becomes is used like a studio really in the lead up to the show. So for me, one of the most creative moments is actually bringing all the different elements together into the space, and then playing around with them and substituting different parts for other parts that you didn't necessarily intend being part of the installation in the first place. And I think that the smaller objects that have existed for over a longer period of time, they also have the ability to kind of interchange with one another or form different groupings. And one of the things you have to deal with if your work ends up in a collection is that in a sense that makes it kind of permanent. So a lot of the temporary elements, like the substances, for instance, that exist within the work, so things like the grease in this show, the axle grease, or the render, or things which don't have the same kind of stability. You have to kind of deal with that aging process, and so that sometimes makes them difficult or impossible to for them to exist as kind of permanent works. I mean, the art world is kind of used to finding solutions for that, but in terms of my mind, I don't think I'm interested in them having that kind of longevity. Here in this show, it's quite interesting to, for the first time really, to see old work and new work side by side, because I'm starting to see connections between all the different works in terms of kind of themes or motifs that kind of transcend kind of timescale from one to the next.